Hi everybody, welcome back to another video lesson. Let me just make this slide larger. All right, so in today's video lesson, we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, which is all about photosynthesis. And Chapter 4, Lesson 1 has us thinking about energy and how it's related to life. To start off, let's think about this hummingbird here in the picture. What activities are being performed by this hummingbird that require energy? So what is this hummingbird doing that requires energy? Well, you might think to yourself, it's flying for one thing. It takes lots of energy for an organism to be able to fly. Also, this organism is eating food. So it's flying and then it has to think and find food and has to eat it. All of that requires energy. Overall, anything that is alive and all of life processes and activities requires energy. Today, our vocabulary words will be ATP. That's going to be a new word for us today. And then photosynthesis is an old word, but we're going to continue talking about it. So starting off, let's talk about the relationship between chemical energy and ATP. Well, cells, which all organisms are made up of cells, they require energy to perform work, and energy makes life possible. Energy can come in many forms, including light, heat, and electricity. So you can get light energy, heat energy, and electrical energy. But we also have chemical energy. Energy can be stored in chemical compounds through bonds between elements or atoms. So elements or atoms, these are words that we started talking about. We're going to get into some examples soon. But whenever you have a chemical bond, I want you to think there's energy being stored in that bond. So if two atoms or two elements are bonded together, there is energy stored in that bond. When bonds between atoms are formed, energy is stored. So when you have one atom and another atom and they make a bond together, energy is formed in that bond. When that bond is broken, so when bonds between atoms are broken, energy gets released. So that's the basics of it, is that when an atom gets bonded to another atom, so when two elements are bonded together, energy is in that bond. And it takes energy to make that bond. In order to get the energy back out, you need to break the bond and energy gets released. And now those two atoms are no longer bonded together. So let's look a little bit deeper at storing energy. So how do cells store energy? Well, it requires something called ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate and a phosphate group. Together, so when energy gets added to these two things, our cells create what's called ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. So all living cells store energy in chemical bonds of certain compounds. Adenosine triphosphate, otherwise known as ATP, it's made up of an adenine, a 5-carbon sugar called a ribose, and 3 phosphate groups. Adding a phosphate group to adenosine diphosphate, which is right over here, adds energy to the molecule and it changes it into ATP. So when energy, along with the phosphate group, gets added to ADP, we create what's called ATP, which has lots of energy stored in it. So I want you to notice how we created a bond between these two things and energy got stored. And now we have a molecule that has a lot of energy. So that's why I highlighted it in yellow. ATP is full of energy. Okay, now what about when a cell wants to release that energy so that it can use it? Well, to release the energy, the ATP gets broken down into ADP and phosphate again. And so this is something that will keep happening over and over and over again. ATP gets released, or gets broken down and energy gets released. And then you end up again with ADP and a phosphate. So when cells require this energy, the energy that's stored in ATP, it removes the third phosphate group from ATP and changes it into ADP again. ATP can release energy by breaking the bonds between its phosphate groups. ATP is the most immediate source of energy for cells. So let's take a look at what ATP looks like. So here it is, ATP. This is its structure broken down. We had an adenine group, we have a ribose, and then 3 phosphate groups. So phosphate is actually a nutrient that all organisms need. And one of the main reasons why organisms need phosphate is because that's how our cells store energy. So ATP is a compound that has stored energy in the phosphate bonds. So notice these little black lines between each of the phosphate atoms. Those black lines represent a chemical bond. And if you go back to the previous slide, energy gets stored in chemical bonds. So there is lots of energy wherever you see these bonds. And this image here shows us, how does ADP become ATP? Well, let's start off with ADP. Adenosine diphosphate, we have the prefix di, which means 2. It has 2 phosphate groups at the end. So notice how there's 2 P's right there. Well, it's inside of a cell, and energy gets released by the breakdown of complex food molecules, and it gets used to convert ADP into ATP. So what this means here is that in our cells break down carbohydrates, which you get from the food that you eat. They break down the carbohydrates for energy. And this energy, so this is the energy from the food that you eat, along with a phosphate group, it gets added to the ADP, and together, ADP, energy, and phosphate creates an ATP molecule. So ATP, ATP is adenosine triphosphate, tri meaning 3. And notice how we now have a third phosphate added over here to the end of this molecule. And there is a bond here. That bond has this energy stored inside of it. And remember, this is the energy that came from breaking down the food that we eat. So ADP has low energy. ATP has high energy. Why does ATP have high energy? Well, because the energy from the carbohydrates that our cells break down got used with the phosphate group to add that phosphate there and create a new bond. All right, well, now what about if the cell wants to use the energy to do one of these cell processes? In order to break down, or in order to get the energy back out of the ATP, all that needs to happen is the phosphate group that was added needs to be removed. So when a cell needs energy, it breaks the phosphate bond, releases the phosphate, and also releases energy. And then you end up again with ADP down here, which has low energy. And this process can be repeated over and over and over again. So why do cells need energy in the first place? Well, cells need energy first because they are essentially what is alive inside of us. So all organisms are made up of 1 or more cells. Humans have about 37 trillion cells, but there's some organisms that are single-celled or unicellular, meaning they are only 1 single cell. But humans are more complex. We have 37 trillion cells in our bodies. Cells use the energy provided by ATP to carry out active transport. The energy also enables cells to move, providing power to motor proteins that contract muscles. So this one might make a little more sense. Our cells use that energy to move our muscles. Active transport is something we'll talk about in later chapters. The energy from ATP also gets transferred into other molecules in the cell to power processes such as protein synthesis. So overall, cells need energy because they do a lot of different functions, and energy is required in order for our cells to do any kind of work. All right, so then how do the cells of organisms even end up with energy to begin with? So where do these carbohydrates that have the energy come from? Well, that's why we started off the year or this unit with talking about ecosystems and the roles that organisms have in an ecosystem. So think back to the word heterotroph and to the word autotroph. Heterotrophs are organisms that must consume other organisms for energy. Why do we eat other food? Well, we're getting the carbohydrates. We're getting the nutrients from that food. Examples of heterotrophs are herbivores, which eat plants, carnivores, which eat animals, omnivores, which eat both plants and animals, scavengers, which eat dead animals, and decomposers, which eat all other organisms that have died, and it recycles the nutrients back into the environment. Let's look at autotrophs. So autotrophs are the opposite of a heterotroph. They do not need to eat another organism because they can convert the energy from the environment, such as sunlight energy or chemical energy, into carbohydrates. And we have two kinds of autotrophs. There is the photosynthetic primary producer and chemosynthetic primary producers. And these are things such as plants. Chemosynthetic primary producers are things such as bacteria that live way at the bottom of the ocean where there's no light. So again, what was this question? How do the cells of organisms get energy? Well, they get energy either by consuming other organisms, so they're getting the energy from carbohydrates that they get from another organism, or they're creating carbohydrates using energy from the environment. So they either get energy from another organism or through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. In this chapter, we're going to focus on photosynthesis. So what is photosynthesis and why is it so important? Well, photosynthesis is the process by which photoautotrophs, or photosynthetic primary producers, convert light energy into chemical energy. Photosynthetic organisms include plants, so that's the very common one, plants, trees, flowers. Algae, which are organisms that live in the water, and then also bacteria known as cyanobacteria. So all of those are examples of photosynthetic organisms. And nearly all life on Earth depends on autotrophs that capture sunlight energy and synthesize high energy carbohydrates. Remember, carbohydrates is just a fancy word for sugar. Carbohydrates are used as the food for our cells because carbohydrates give our cells energy. Our cells use that energy to make ATP. And that is the end of this lecture. Please make sure that you read Chapter 4, Lesson 1 before coming to class, either on Thursday if you're in periods 1, 3, 5, or before Friday if you're in period 2 or 6. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.